Captain Simon Dowling, it's very good to have you with us for this TED Talk.
It's a pleasure to be here. So just by way of introduction, Simon Dowling, I'm Group Captain in the Royal Air Force, and I've been in for 30 years, really a career in two halves. The first half was flying, but the more pertinent half and the purpose of this talk really is of that second half. Of the 16 years I've spent out of the cockpit, I've done 14 years overseas. I've been stationed in South America, in Spain, in the Middle East twice, the USA, in Europe as well, on full tours, as well as the operational ones that we've all done, Afghan, and also I did one in Qatar. So that's kind of where I've spent the last several years, and is pertinent to what we're talking about.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you for the introduction. Of course, our subject is on decision making and what influences us, and clearly there are going to be some very interesting experiences and expertise you have in the cultural aspect of decision making, which I'm sure we'll get into over the next 20 minutes or so. And perhaps we can start the discussion with just inviting you to perhaps share your sort of slightly more general insights, if you like, on the question about what influences us from the point of view of decision making, either from a personal perspective or perhaps from the organisations that you've led in your career. So,
yes, I guess it's an interesting question, and I'd start by saying I've never been an academic in the field of decision making. What do the theories say? But you learn as you go, and you learn from experience. You learn from good mentors and etc. But I guess the first question is, it depends what the desired outcome is. Are you making a decision for your nation, or are you making a decision for a coalition? Are you making a decision for NATO, perhaps, which is interesting because that's consensus. And I've been involved in all of those. So decision making will start with what is the desired outcome and who's effectively in charge of it. Do I need to bring people with me? Do I just want to hear their opinion? I guess the other thing is I'm very much in favour of getting other people's opinion. Now, it will always depend on the time available, and somebody needs to own the decision, and you need to not be afraid of that. But to ask your sort of, if you like, exec team, those people that you work with and you trust, and they'll be smart, for sure. Also, if you've got the time, maybe go to somebody that is likely to tell you things you don't want to hear, or tell you things that really are maybe a little bit left of field. But at the end of the day, you get all of that. And the other variable is, how much information do you have? Do you have facts, or do you have subjecture, or do you have a good idea? Is it intelligence driven, or is it factually driven? Is it politically motivated? There are so many different ways that you can be affected. But at the end of the day, somebody's got to own the decision, and in the instance it's you, then you've got to just be brave in delivering it. But if you've got the time available, bring other people into the process so that you feel more comfortable at the end.
Simon, thank you for that. So I think that already you've shared several insights there into the process, and you, as you say, being clear about what the outcome or the purposes of a decision. You mentioned about always being really clear that whatever the process, that somebody has to own it, and if that's you, then to be clear about that. The context being important, and you started to touch on almost the different ways that the decisions can be made. Other circumstances in which they're consensus, other circumstances in which they're slightly more authoritarian, perhaps. But also, you're almost, and these are my words, almost your kind of natural instinct is that if you have that choice, it's to bring others into that decision who may be experts in their own fields, that you've participated, or you've built a participation in the decision, even though you're taking responsibility for it yourself. So those seem to be some of the elements that are a consideration when you're thinking through a decision. Is that fair? Is there anything else there that I've missed that you'd like to highlight?
No, that's absolutely fair, yes.
Okay, great. And the first thing that you mentioned NATO as one example where clearly that for you represents a significant difference in decision-making culture. Would that be fair to say, from perhaps the one that would exist perhaps purely in the Royal Air Force? Perhaps you could just unpick that a little bit more for us?
Yeah, I mean, the word cultural in itself could is something you could spend hours unpicking, because there are cultural issues in the way that people do business, perhaps in the NATO environment. But really, everybody who sits around the table in NATO is representing their nation, if they're a representative of their nation. I personally worked for NATO, in which case I was an arbitrator, and I was a meeting chairperson. And so I'd sit around with the 28 nations, as it was then, it's 29, and they would be representing the nation's view. Now, some of them would then be influenced by their human nature, or the stereotype that we might hold of various nations. And stereotypes are there for a reason, and they do come out. But yeah, I would say NATO, it's more the political landscape that you need to walk around. For example, the French are very they're very concerned about the money that NATO spend, and why shouldn't they be? But you will know, if you're chairing a meeting, that if the issue of how much it's going to cost isn't covered, then the French will raise it, and they will want to know because their capital has told them that that's really important. The Germans, for example, have issues about kinetic type of operations, but there are ways around getting to the end result you might want if the language is appropriate, which doesn't implicate them or doesn't allow for there to be a potential misperception of what the Germans are signing up to. You've got others with the Greece and Turkey have an interesting history, and they're both part of NATO. So, those are issues as well. And I could give you an example of every country.
I'm quite sure you could, but it's such a shame that we don't have time to go around all 29, actually, because I'm sure it would be really quite interesting to do. So in terms of I probably can try and imagine you being in that environment where you sort of have 29 different nations contributing to the decision-making process. And you mentioned that each nation has its own national interest to promote or to have protected, if you like, in those discussions. You also mentioned the stereotyping issue, Simon, and in your experience, does that work for or against the decision-making process? In it's our natural tendency, isn't it, as humans, to stereotype, whether that stereotype is a national tendency. Is that something that you worked with? How did that play into the process of decision-making?
Well, it absolutely does, but it can work for and against. And this is why I would advocate the need for, if you like, I don't want to say specialists, because it is a niche area, but everybody has to start somewhere, and I started, if you like, in Spain and then moved to Latin America. Now, there are lots of stereotypes there. You learn what people are like, and then you learn how to work around it. It's more likely, in my opinion, that if somebody is conforming to a stereotype, that if you aren't aware of it, that it will damage the situation because you're not aware of it. Leveraging it to your advantage is actually more of a second level skill, if you like. If you know how people maybe think, or when they think certain things, when is the best time to approach them in the best manner, yeah, definitely it might help. But to not be aware that the way you might approach somebody because of the way they are culturally will be detrimental is much more likely, if that makes sense.
Yes, it certainly does. And I lived in France for 17 years, and a classic example is the American business breakfast was anathema in France. They couldn't conceive of the idea of doing business and having breakfast at the same time. And sort of knowledge of those kind of stereotypes allows you almost like that first intro. I think that's where you're going with it. Is it it allows you to not make those faux pas in your first conversations with somebody, and then you've got obviously then there's a second level of process of understanding a little more detail. Is that how you see it, or not?
Yeah, well, it's a tremendously interesting and complex area because, yes, in a way, but, the first thing I would say is you need to know yourself. You need to have emotional intelligence about yourself. What are you like as a human being? Are you quite confident? Are you quite chatty, quite loud? How do you come across to other people? Because you need to understand yourself, because that will affect how you see other people. But you also need to know that other people are different. So yes, you can ruin something by a bad intro, but actually, if you understand what you're like, and then you're aware that, yeah, they might conform to the stereotype, but with 250 million Americans, they're not all going to be the same. So you need to, it's a starter with which you need to work from, not, if you like, the answer.
That's a really good insight. So it's a place that almost allows you to have that initial engagement and know to make that. Out of interest, you mentioned about knowing yourself as well. It's almost a really fundamental-ish point, isn't it? How did you ever get the impression about how they saw you as a Brit in terms of and did that affect the nature of the relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I did. The Spanish have a phrase, Flemma Britannica, which just means that the stereotypical British person, if you like. For example, one of the things that includes is being punctual. Because in Spain, you get invited for dinner at 7, which you would 9 instead of 7 as you would in the UK, perhaps. If you turn up at 9, they'll just laugh because nobody else will turn up until 9:30. So, and in a way, if it's a good thing, punctuality from a British perspective is a good thing. So it's good to conform to that stereotype. We're also perceived to be, in my experience, particularly in NATO, hardworking and likely to have a good opinion on the subject. People won't always agree with you, but your opinion as a military person will be respected. Your work ethic will be expected and respected, and so they're kind of good things. I mean, the negatives are we're cold and we're emotionless and we don't like to have fun. But all you need to do is take them out for a beer and disavow them of that, and you're off.
And disprove it. Thank you, Simon. And coming back to the to our subject of decision making, and perhaps just thinking about how what we've just been uncovering a little bit in terms of some of those national stereotypes. Some of the classic kind of aspects of decision making in terms of, are they evidence based? Are they more consensual versus more individual decision making process? How some of the issues around ethics and complexity and ambiguity. Can you just give us some insights about how, whether it's those stereotypes or how different national cultural approaches play out in that regard? Do you see that, and do you play with that in the decision-making process?
It's quite difficult. I mean, I'm trying to think, and I'm not sure I'm going to answer the question. But if you're in Argentina, where I was, then and the Falkland Islands becomes an issue, then you're obviously on a quite a sensitive topic, and we had a war, and so that would be an area where, if you were getting into issues of the Falkland Islands, you might completely need to change tack, because the Argentines as a nation are very Anglo-friendly, if you like. They love the Brits, and there's a lot of might there. So you might maybe adapt how you were behaving and how you were trying to arrive at a decision. And again, kind of similar with, I was also in Gibraltar, and Gibraltar will see everything, day-to-day activity, school, shopping, with a lens of Spain there constantly. The Spanish are, putting prices up. We go across the border. There's, too many Spanish coming to Gibraltar every day. They want to change our schooling system, and so if you're dealing with Gibraltarians, the lens through which they see life, which includes Spain frequently, is something you need to be aware of and navigate. I don't know if there's a better word.
So it's being aware. So when you're in that particular cultural milieu, it's being very much aware, and the need to be aware of some of those historical and geographical and political dynamics that inform the way they look at the decision-making process. I guess that would be one of the key things. I mean, I was thinking of an example, and when I was in France, it was quite common. I mean, it's not always the case, but you would, in terms of meetings and decisions, it was often the case that decisions would be made quite informally outside a meeting, and the meeting itself was to inform people about the fact that the decision had been made and to sort of get questions on it. Whereas I think in the UK we tend to have them a little bit more sort of consensual and to make decisions. I mean, have you noticed that? Is that something that you picked up on in terms of the processes that people instinctively use to go about the decision-making process?
Yeah, I can't, apart from the standard, and it is very much a Brit way of doing stuff, you'll try and set the meeting up for success by briefing your principal if you're the briefer, or having been briefed by your team if you're at the table, so that you kind of, what you want and you hope you can get there. Yeah. And I can't say that my experiences are particularly different in Latin America, Spain, maybe the Middle East is, there's a lot of stuff that's done off book in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. But again, the variety of nations involved there means that there are a lot of individual differences within that.
Yeah, it's often that's interesting. It's a question of whether there's a sort of an informality about the way decisions are made versus the sort of formal structures of decision making. Seems to me to be one of the ways that sometimes you see a bit of a cultural difference in there. I'm wondering, it's always curious to me as whether there's some sort of general good practice developing almost regardless of the culture about how you make effective decisions. Is that something that you would agree to, or not?
Well, I'm not sure. Possibly not, because I would go almost back to my intro, that not ever having been through sort of the academic process of what models there might be available, you're almost you're relying on instinct, experience, and your own individual personality.
Yeah.
And for your own decision making, and how do I see other people do it? Good, bad, and indifferent. But I couldn't put a model on that, if you like.
Right. Which is absolutely understandable. And so I was wondering if there's and as ever we're up against our time for these interviews. So can you think of an example that you can share with us of a decision that's been taken that perhaps illustrates some of the kind of cultural nuances of the decision-making process, back to your NATO days or more recently?
I'd like, you talked about NATO a bit. I'd love to give you a Latin American one, because that's such a fascinating dynamic. But NATO is the best example, and the best example was probably the very last thing I did after sort of a 3 and a bit year tour there, and I was chairing a meeting, and it was all going really quite well, and it was about the enhanced NATO forward presence that was out in sort of the Baltic regions, and extra troops, 4 I think battalions out there, different nations, and we were kind of getting to the decision point of agreeing consensus, which would then go to be ratified at the ministerial level. And I won't say who, one of the Baltic nations said something that another Baltic nation took offence to, and that was it. And then they said, no, I don't agree with that. Well, and then you're sitting there as a chairman saying, well, you agreed with it 30 minutes ago when we actually dealt with it specifically, and now you're suddenly telling me you're not. And you go and you're trying to be, in a UK meeting, you'd be very black and white. Why? You've changed your mind. I'm not happy. Explain. But you can't, and you try and work your way around it, knowing kind of full well what was going on. You couldn't get them to change. And then that escalated to 2 more meetings and in transpositions, and then it got elevated to the to the chairman of the military committee, who's there still now, Air Chief Marshal Peach. So he then had to chair a meeting at the military committee level before it went to the Secretary General himself. And we were doing all sorts of things offline to try and basically get the one nation to retract what they'd said unofficially, so the other nation could retract what they'd said officially, which was holding it all up. And it was fascinating, frustrating, and actually NATO through and through. And we got there in the end. So,
so you did get to a result.
It was my last day in the building was the day that the Air Chief Marshal Peach resolved it, with me running around the table of 29 with little handwritten notes saying, if he says this, will you say this? No, yes. And eventually we got it done.
You actually managed to go. And that all came down to one comment in one meeting when the decision had already been made, and then all of those issues. Was there anything at all, I mean, a reflection that might have happened that would have avoided it, or was almost kind of an inevitability about it?
No, it was absolutely not inevitable.
Yeah.
It was absolutely caught me off guard after 3 years and maybe, I don't know, chairing over 50 meetings, which had gone good, bad, and indifferent. But it completely caught me off guard, and it caught everybody else off guard. And actually, you've got some really helpful people around the table. You know, the French guy intervened, and then the Italian intervened to try and encourage them to sort it out. And can we help? And no, so. Sometimes it just happens and you deal with it.
They just dug into their metaphorical trenches, as it were.
Yeah.
And so it just goes to show, doesn't it, that no matter how expert you are and how much support you've got, those cultural issues can just rise up and bite you at an unexpected moment, and can have those consequences as a result. So, well, it was good to hear that you did manage to get that final resolution even on the last day. So, Simon, thank you so much. As usual, we're up against our time. A really fascinating conversation, and I think it just really remains for me to thank you so much on behalf of the TED Academy and the University of Lincoln for your insights in our discussion today. Thank you so much.
That's an absolute pleasure.
Brilliant. Thank you, Simon.
Take care.